Renna Ravok had never been afraid of a bet in her life, which was exactly how she found herself standing frozen in the doorway of the Copper Bell Tavern, her green skin flushed darker with mortification, staring at the most recent and catastrophic example of her competitive streak gone wrong. The bet had been simple enough. She'd been arm wrestling the blacksmith's son, a hulking human boy who thought his bulk would make up for technique. Renna had grown up breaking horses on the steppes to the north, and her forearms were corded with muscle despite her small frame. She dropped him in under 10 seconds, and the table had erupted in cheers and groans depending on who'd wagered what. Then Magda, the tavern keeper's wife, had cackled and said Renna was too cocky, that she wouldn't dare take a real wager. Pride, as it always did, had reared up in Renna's chest like an unbroken stallion. "Name it," Renna had said. Magda's eyes had gleamed. "Next round, you win. Drinks are on the house for a week. But if you lose, you have to kiss the next man who walks through that door." Full kiss, not a peck on the cheek. The table had gone silent and then exploded with laughter and shouts. Renna should have known better. She'd only been in Millbrook Valley for 3 weeks, brought in by old Garrett to help with his breeding stock, and she was still proving herself. Still, she'd looked at the blacksmith's son, who was flexing his fingers and glowering, and she'd nodded. Deal. She'd won again, of course. Another 8 seconds and his knuckles hit the scarred wood. But Magda had leaned across the bar with a grin that showed all her teeth and said, "A bet's a bet, green girl. Rules were for the round, not the match. You accepted the terms." Renna had opened her mouth to argue, but the entire tavern had taken up the chant. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Even old Garrett, nursing his ale in the corner, had been grinning into his cup. She'd stood there, her small tusks catching the firelight, her pointed ears burning, and realized she'd been had. Honor mattered. It mattered more than embarrassment. So she'd squared her shoulders, turned toward the door, and waited. The door had swung open a moment later, letting in the cool spring evening and a man Renna had seen exactly once before, at Garrett's fence line when he'd come to borrow a harrow. He was tall and lean, with brown hair that curled at his collar and lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of smiles and squinting into the sun. He wore a carpenter's leather apron, sawdust still clinging to his shirt, and on his hip, nestled against his side with a chubby arm around his neck, was a toddler, perhaps 2 years old, with the same brown curls and solemn blue eyes. The man stopped in the doorway, taking in the silent tavern, the expectant faces, and Renna standing 3 feet away with what she was certain was an expression of absolute horror. "Evening," he said carefully. His voice was warm like oak honey. "Is this a bad time?" the tavern erupted. Someone shouted, "Perfect time." And Magda cackled again and said, "Phillip Woods, you just won the maiden's prize." Phillip, because apparently that was his name, looked down at Renna. She barely came up to his collarbone, and she saw the exact moment comprehension dawned in his eyes. His eyebrows went up. The toddler on his hip made a questioning sound and patted his father's cheek. "I lost a bet," Renna said flatly. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, edged with humiliation and defiance in equal measure. "I have to kiss you. They won't shut up about it unless I do." For a heartbeat, she thought he might laugh or refuse or make some joke that would let her off the hook. Instead, Phillip Woods shifted his son a little higher on his hip, glanced at the rowdy crowd, and then looked back at her with something like sympathy in his eyes. "Well," he said, "I suppose there are worse forfeits." He bent down slightly, tilting his head so she could reach. Renna's heart was hammering. She could smell sawdust and soap and something sweet, maybe honey from the child's dinner. The tavern had gone almost quiet, all watching. She pushed up on her toes, braced one hand against Philip's chest solid, warm through the linen, and pressed her lips to his. It was supposed to be quick. A peck, a show, enough to satisfy Magda's cruel sense of humor and get the crowd off her back. But the moment her mouth touched his, something shifted. His lips were soft and he didn't pull away. For 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, they stayed like that, and Renna felt a jolt of something unfamiliar and terrifying run straight through her chest into her stomach. She pulled back like she'd been burned. Phillip straightened, his expression unreadable. The toddler, oblivious, reached for Renna's pointed ear with a delighted sound, but Phillip caught the small hand gently. "Not polite, Tobias," he murmured. The tavern exploded into cheers and whistles. Someone started pounding the table. Renna turned on her heel and fled into the kitchen, past Magda's knowing grin, out the back door into the cool night air where she could press her hands to her burning cheeks and try to remember how to breathe. She'd kissed men before. Not many her life had been horses and travel and proving she could do any job a human could do, but enough to know what attraction felt like. This had been different. This had felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, and she was still falling. "Damn it," she whispered to the stars, and then again, louder, "Damn it." Inside, the noise had returned to normal levels. She could hear laughter and the clink of mugs. She should go back in, take the teasing, show she didn't care. Instead, she walked the long way back to Garrett's farm, her thoughts churning like a winter storm. The next morning, Renna woke to the sound of Garrett's rooster and the knowledge that she had made a complete fool of herself. She rolled out of the narrow bed in the loft above the stable, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to focus on the day's work. Garrett had 3 mares due to foal within the month, and one of them was a skittish bay who'd been abused before Garrett bought her. Renna had been spending hours each day in the paddock, just sitting, letting the mare get used to her presence. She was mucking out stalls when Garrett came in, leaning on his cane. He was ancient or close to it, with a beard like iron wool and hands gnarled by decades of work. "Heard you caused quite a stir last night," he said. Renna drove the pitchfork into the soiled straw with more force than necessary. "Magda cheated. Magda always cheats. That's why you don't bet with her. You could have warned me." Garrett chuckled, a sound like stones grinding. "Where's the fun in that? Besides, Phillip's a good man. You could do worse for a first kiss in the valley." "It wasn't a first kiss, it was a forfeit, a joke. Hum. Garrett's tone suggested he didn't believe that for a second. "Phillip's a widower. Wife died 2 winters back, birthing sickness. He's been raising Tobias alone, running his cooperage, trying to keep his head above water. Doesn't come to town much anymore." Renna paused, the pitchfork still in her hands. She hadn't known that. The grief explained the lines around his eyes, maybe, or the careful way he'd looked at her. She pushed the sympathy down. It didn't matter. She was here to work with horses, save enough to buy her own breeding pair and move on. She didn't have time for complications. "Good for him," she said shortly. "Doesn't change anything." Garrett made a non-committal sound and shuffled out, leaving Renna alone with her thoughts and the horses. She managed to avoid town for 3 days. Then Garrett sent her to the mill for feed, and she had no choice but to hitch the wagon and drive into Millbrook. The village was small, a cluster of buildings around a stone bridge where the mill wheel churned. She kept her head down, loaded the sacks, and was almost back to the wagon when a small voice said, "Green lady." Renna turned. Tobias was sitting on a bench outside the cooper's workshop, his legs swinging, a wooden horse clutched in one hand. Phillip stood in the doorway, a plane in his hand, watching his son with the expression of a man who knew he should intervene but wasn't sure how. Tobias slid off the bench and toddled toward her with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never learned to be afraid. Renna froze. She had no idea what to do with children. "Horses, yes. Children, no. Hello," she said cautiously. "You kiss Papa," Tobias announced. He held up the wooden horse. "This is Bess. That's a good name." Renna glanced at Phillip, who had set down the plane and was walking over, wiping his hands on his apron. His expression was rueful. "Tobias, you can't just run up to people," he said gently. He scooped the boy up, settled him on his hip again. "Sorry. He's been talking about the Green Lady for 3 days. I think he's fascinated." "Most people are," Renna said, aiming for dry humor and landing somewhere closer to bitter. Philip's eyes, she noticed now, were very blue like deep water. "He doesn't mean anything by it. He's too. Everything's new and interesting. It's fine." She shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how small she was compared to him, how the sun caught in his hair. This was ridiculous. She cleared her throat. "I should go. Garrett's waiting." "Renna," Phillip said, and then stopped. He looked uncertain, and she realized with a jolt that he was just as awkward about this as she was. "Look, about the other night. I know that wasn't I mean. I'm sorry you got roped into that." "You didn't do anything wrong," Renna said quickly. "It was my own fault for betting with Magda. Still." He shifted Tobias to his other hip. The boy was still staring at Renna with wide eyes, fascinated. "People in town can be. It's a small place. Rumors spread. If anyone's been giving you trouble, I can handle myself," Renna interrupted, pride again, sharp and defensive. She saw the way his expression shuddered just a little and felt a pang of regret. She softened her tone. "But thank you. That's kind." For a moment they just looked at each other. Renna could hear the mill wheel turning, the creak of the wagon behind her, the distant sound of someone hammering. Then Tobias leaned forward and patted her shoulder with his small hand. "Nice Green Lady," he said solemnly. Despite herself, Renna smiled. Her tusks showed, small and white, and she saw Philip's expression warm. "Nice boy," she said back, and Tobias beamed. She left before the moment could stretch into something more. On the drive back to Garrett's farm, she tried to convince herself that the lightness in her chest was just relief, not something more dangerous. Over the next 2 weeks, Renna threw herself into work. The skittish bay mare, whom Garrett had named Clover, was slowly coming around. Renna spent hours in the paddock, moving slowly, speaking in low tones, letting Clover approach on her own terms. The mare was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen, and Renna watched her carefully for signs of distress. Horses who'd been mistreated sometimes had trouble foaling, their bodies too tense, their minds too fractured by fear. Garrett watched from the fence, approving. "You've got a gift," he said one afternoon. "Never seen anyone calm a horse like you do." Renna shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Horses don't care if you're orc or human. They care if you're patient. Wish more humans thought like horses." That was true enough. She'd had her share of slurs shouted from passing wagons, of doors shut in her face, of people clutching their children and crossing the street. Millbrook was better than some places. The frontier tended to care more about what you could do than what you looked like, but the prejudice was still there, simmering under the surface. She went to the Copper Bell once more, because Garrett wanted company and she owed him that much. This time, she kept her back to the wall and didn't take any bets. Magda brought her ale without comment, and the blacksmith's son stayed on the other side of the room. Renna thought she'd made it through the evening without incident, and then someone, a farmer she didn't recognize, deep in his cups said loudly, "That's the orc who kissed Phillip Woods, isn't it? Poor bastard. Bet he had to scrub his mouth out after." The table around him laughed, sharp and ugly. Renna set down her mug carefully. Her hands wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them. Garrett put a hand on her arm. "Not worth it," he murmured. "Probably trying to trap him," another voice added. "You know how orcs are. Breed like rabbits. Need a man to." Renna was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to move. She crossed the room in 3 strides, and the farmer looked up just in time for her to grab the front of his shirt, and haul him half out of his chair. She was small, but she was strong, and he yelped in surprise. "Say that again," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her tusks were bared. "I want to make sure I heard you right." The farmer's face went red, then white. It was a joke. Funny, I'm not laughing." She let him go, and he dropped back into his chair hard enough to rattle the table. "Anyone else have something to say?" Silence. The entire tavern was watching. Renna could feel her heart pounding, adrenaline singing through her veins. She turned and walked out, Garrett limping behind her, and didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Renna leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Garrett patted her shoulder. "Handled that well," he said. "I shouldn't have lost my temper. Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes people need to know where the line is." He sighed. "But you're right that it'll cause talk. Might want to lay low for a bit." Renna nodded. She felt sick, angry, and ashamed all at once. She'd come here to work, to prove herself, and instead she'd become the subject of tavern gossip. All because of a stupid bet and a kiss that should have meant nothing. Except it hadn't meant nothing. That was the problem. The next day, Garrett asked her to deliver a repaired harness to Phillip Woods. Renna stared at him, certain he was meddling, but the old man's face was innocent. "Can't do it myself," he said, waving his cane. "Knee's acting up, and you know where his place is." She did. It was a small farmstead on the eastern edge of the valley, close to the forest. She'd ridden past it twice. She took the harness, slung it over her shoulder, and set out on foot, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. Phillip's farm was neat and well kept, though she could see places where the work had slipped. The fence needed mending. Weeds were creeping into the kitchen garden. The cooperative itself was a solid building, the door propped open to let in the spring breeze. She could hear the rhythmic sound of hammering from inside. She was halfway across the yard when Tobias came barreling around the corner, chasing a chicken. He saw her and stopped short, his face lighting up. "Green lady!" He shrieked and launched himself at her legs. Renna barely managed to catch him, the harness slipping off her shoulder. Tobias wrapped his arms around her knees, beaming up at her. The chicken, forgotten, flapped away indignantly. "Hello, Tobias," Renna said, bemused. Phillip appeared a moment later, wiping his forehead. He saw Renna and stopped, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and then something warmer. "Renna." "I didn't." "Sorry, Tobias, let her go. You can't just tackle people. It's all right." Renna gently disentangled the boy's arms and crouched down to his level. "You're fast. Bet you could catch that chicken if you really tried." Tobias considered this seriously. "Chickens are tricky." "They are," Renna agreed. She glanced up at Phillip, who was watching them with an expression she couldn't read. "Garrett sent me. Harness is fixed." Phillip blinked, then seemed to remember himself. "Right, thank you. Come in, I'll get the coin already settled," Renna said, standing. She held out the harness. Phillip took it, his fingers brushing hers for just a second. The touch felt electric. "At least let me offer you a drink," Phillip said. "Water, or I think there's cider." She should say no. She should leave, go back to Garrett's, keep her distance. Instead, she found herself nodding. "Cider sounds good." Phillip's farmhouse was small but tidy, the kind of place that spoke of care even in the face of exhaustion. There was a pot of stew simmering over the fire, the smell rich and savory. A basket of mending sat in the corner, and Tobias's wooden toys were scattered across the floor. Phillip poured 2 cups of cider from a jug and handed her one, then scooped Tobias up and settled him at the table with a crust of bread. "Sorry about the mess," Phillip said, though the house was hardly messy. "It's been a busy week." "Looks fine to me," Renna said. She sipped the cider, sweet and tart, probably from his own trees. "You keep bees?" "A few hives. Enough for Tobias and a trade." He leaned against the table, watching her. "I heard about last night at the tavern. Renna's hand tightened on the cup. "News travels fast. It's a small valley." His voice was gentle. "For what it's worth, that farmer's an idiot, and you had every right to be angry." "I shouldn't have grabbed him, maybe," Phillip shrugged. "But he shouldn't have said what he did. People talk, Renna. It doesn't mean they're right." She looked at him, really looked at him. There was kindness in his face, and something else, an understanding, maybe, of what it was to be the subject of gossip. A widower with a small child trying to make a life. It wasn't the same as being an orc in a human town, but it was its own kind of lonely. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked quietly. Phillip looked surprised. "Why wouldn't I be? Most people aren't." He was silent for a moment, turning his own cup in his hands. Tobias hummed to himself, oblivious. "My wife Anna, she used to say that kindness costs nothing, and after she died, people in town were kind to me. Brought food, watched Tobias, helped with the cooperage. I don't know what I would have done without them." He met her eyes. "So I figure I should pass that on when I can." Renna's chest felt tight. She looked down at her cider, at her reflection distorted in the amber liquid. "That's rare." "It shouldn't be." They talked for an hour and then another. Phillip showed her the cooperage, the barrels he was working on, the neat rows of staves and hoops. Tobias trailed after them, chattering about Bess, the wooden horse, and the tricky chickens. Renna found herself relaxing, laughing at Tobias's antics, asking questions about the cooperage that Phillip answered with quiet pride. When she finally left, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Thank you," she said at the door, "for the cider and the conversation." "Anytime," Phillip said, and she thought he meant it. As she walked back to Garrett's, Renna realized with a sinking feeling that she was in trouble. She'd spent years keeping people at a distance, protecting herself from the hurt that came with hoping, with caring. And now, because of a stupid bet and a kiss that was supposed to mean nothing, she was falling for a kind widower and his small son, and she had no idea how to stop. Spring deepened into early summer. The days grew longer and warmer, and Garrett's mares began to foal. The first 2 births went smoothly, the foals leggy and bright-eyed, their mothers calm. Clover, the skittish bay, was the last, and Renna watched her with growing concern. The mare was close to her time, but she was tense, her ears always back, her eyes rolling at every sound. "She's scared," Renna told Garrett. "She needs quiet. No one else in the barn when it happens." "You planning to sleep out there?" Garrett asked, amused. "If I have to." In the end, she did. She set up a bedroll in the empty stall next to Clover's and spent the nights dozing lightly, listening for any change in the mare's breathing. On the 3rd night, Clover's water broke, and Renna was on her feet instantly. The mare paced, restless and frightened, and Renna spoke to her in low, soothing tones, the orc words of her childhood mixed with the common tongue. "Easy, girl. You're all right. You know what to do." It was a long labor, longer than it should have been. Clover kept trying to lie down and then lurching back up, too panicked to commit. Renna stayed close, her hands ready, her voice steady. Just when she was starting to think she'd need to intervene, Clover finally lay down, sides heaving, and the foal began to come. It was a filly, dark bay like her mother, with a white star on her forehead. She was small and perfect, and Clover, despite her fear, turned to nuzzle her baby with a tenderness that made Renna's throat tight. She cleaned the filly, checked her breathing, made sure she was nursing, and only then allowed herself to sit back against the stall wall, exhausted and triumphant. Garrett found her there at dawn, asleep with straw in her hair and Clover's trusting eyes on her. He chuckled and didn't wake her. Word of the foaling spread, as word did in the valley. Garrett's horses had a reputation, and people came to see the new foals, to discuss breeding prices, to admire the filly with the white star. Renna stayed in the background, letting Garrett take the credit, but she saw the way people looked at her, still wary, but with a grudging respect. She was in town a week later, buying nails at the blacksmith's, when Tobias spotted her through the window of the general store. He pressed his face to the glass, shouting her name, and Renna couldn't help but smile. Phillip opened the door a moment later, Tobias already halfway down the steps. "Sorry," Phillip said, breathless. "He saw you and bolted. Tobias, hold my hand. Green lady." Tobias grabbed Renna's free hand, swinging it. "Papa, can she come to the house?" "Tobias, it's all right," Renna said quickly. She looked at Phillip. "I don't want to impose." "You're not." Philip's smile was warm, a little shy. "Actually, I was going to ask, I know you're busy, but Tobias has been asking about the foals. Would it be all right if we visited Garrett's farm sometime? I'd like him to see them, of course." The words came easily, and Renner realized she meant them. "Garrett won't mind. And Clover's filly is gentle. Tobias can pet her if he's careful." "Can we go now?" Tobias asked, bouncing. "Not now. Renna's working and so am I." Phillip glanced at her. "Maybe tomorrow if the weather holds." "Tomorrow's good." They came the next afternoon, Tobias riding on Philip's shoulders, chattering the entire way. Garrett greeted them with a nod and a knowing look at Renna, who ignored him. She led Tobias into the barn, Phillip following, and showed him the foals. Tobias was entranced, his eyes huge, his voice dropping to a whisper as if he were in a temple. "So small," he breathed. "They'll get bigger," Renna said. She knelt beside him, holding his hand, guiding it to the filly's soft nose. Clover watched but didn't flinch, trusting Renna to keep her baby safe. "Gentle, like this." Tobias stroked the filly with the kind of reverence only a child could muster. Phillip stood back, watching, and when Renna glanced at him, she saw something in his face that made her heart skip. After, Garrett offered them cider and bread, and they sat in the shade of the old oak tree by the barn. Tobias fell asleep in Phillip's lap, worn out by excitement, and Garrett excused himself to check the fences. Renna and Phillip sat in comfortable silence, the afternoon stretching long and golden around them. "He hasn't been this happy in a long time," Phillip said quietly, looking down at his son. "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," Renna said. "You did. You were patient with him. You let him touch the foal. You treated him like he mattered." Phillip's voice was rough. "You'd be surprised how many people don't." Renna didn't know what to say to that. She looked at Tobias, his small face peaceful in sleep, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "He's a good kid," she said finally. "He is." Phillip hesitated, then said, "Renna, can I ask you something, all right? That night at the tavern, the kiss, did it?" He stopped, struggling for words. "I've been thinking about it, more than I should, and I can't tell if it's wrong. He broke off, his jaw tight. Renna's heart was pounding. She'd been trying not to think about the kiss, trying not to remember the way his lips had felt against hers, the warmth of his chest under her hand. Trying not to admit that she'd been finding excuses to see him, to talk to him, to be near him. "You're asking if I felt it too," she said quietly. Phillip looked at her, his eyes very blue. Yes, she could lie. She could brush it off, say it was just a forfeit, nothing more. It would be safer. Easier. But Renna had never been good at lying, and she'd never been a coward. "Yes," she said. "I felt it." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Tobias stirred in Phillip's lap, murmuring something about chickens, and Phillip adjusted his hold automatically, his eyes never leaving Renna's face. "I don't know what to do with that," he said finally. "I haven't since Anna died. I haven't even thought about." He took a breath. "I feel guilty. Like I'm betraying her. But then I see you and I think—" He stopped again, shaking his head. "You think what?" Renna asked softly. "I think maybe it's all right to want something for myself again." Renna's throat was tight. She wanted to reach out to touch his hand, to tell him that it was all right, that wanting wasn't betrayal. But before she could, Garrett's voice called from the barn and the moment broke. They didn't speak of it again that day, but when Phillip left with Tobias drowsing on his shoulder, he looked back at her, and the look said everything. Over the following weeks, Renna found herself at Phillip's farm more often than not. At first, it was for practical reasons. His fence needed mending, and she was good with her hands. His garden was being overrun by rabbits, and she showed him how to build a better barrier. Tobias wanted to see the foals again, and it was easier to meet at Phillip's place, halfway between. But as the visits became more frequent, the excuses grew thinner, and Renna stopped bothering to make them. She learned the rhythms of Phillip's life. He rose before dawn to start the fire, to make Tobias breakfast, to get a few hours of work done before the boy woke. He worked through the day, barrels and buckets and tubs, his hands always moving, always creating. In the evenings he cooked simple meals, played with Tobias, sang him to sleep with old songs that made Renna's chest ache. He was tired all the time, she realized. Bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from months and years of never having a moment to rest. "When's the last time you had a full night's sleep?" she asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch, Tobias asleep inside, the stars bright overhead. Phillip laughed, a sound without much humor. Before Tobias was born, probably. Anna used to take the night shift sometimes, but after he shrugged. "It's fine, I'm used to it." "That's not the same as fine." "No," he admitted, "but it's what I've got." Renna studied him in the starlight. His hair needed cutting, and there were shadows under his eyes that never seemed to fade. "What if you had help?" "I can't afford to hire anyone. And I wouldn't feel right asking." "I'm not asking for coin," Renna interrupted. "I'm saying, what if I helped? With Tobias or the farm or whatever you need." Phillip looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why would you do that?" "Because I care about you. Because watching you run yourself into the ground hurts. Because Tobias deserves to have his father rested and whole. Because I'm falling in love with both of you and I don't know how to stop." "Because you need it," Renna said instead. "And because I want to." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right, but only if you let me repay you somehow." "I don't need Renna." His voice was firm, and she heard the pride underneath. "Let me give something back, please." She nodded, understanding. They worked out an arrangement. 3 mornings a week, Renna would come to the farm, watch Tobias while Phillip worked, help with whatever needed doing. In exchange, Phillip would teach her coopering. She'd always been curious about the craft, and he'd trade her vegetables from his garden, honey from his hives. It was practical and sensible, and it gave them a reason to see each other that had nothing to do with the kiss or the feelings that were growing between them like wildflowers. The first morning, Renna arrived to find Tobias already awake and Phillip looking frazzled. The boy had gotten into the flour bin and was covered head to toe in white powder. Renna took one look and started laughing, and Phillip, after a moment of stunned silence, laughed too. "He's quick," Phillip said, scooping up the flour-covered child. "Turned my back for 1 second." "I can see that." Renna held out her hands. "Give him here. I'll clean him up. You go work." "Are you sure, Phillip?" "Go." He went, though he looked back twice. Renna carried Tobias to the water barrel, stripped off his flour-dusted clothes, and washed him down while he giggled and splashed. By the time she had him clean and dressed in fresh clothes, Phillip was already in the cooperage, the sound of hammering drifting across the yard. Tobias was easier than she'd expected. He was curious and energetic, but he listened when she told him no, and he had a sweetness that reminded her of Phillip. They spent the morning exploring the farm, collecting eggs from the chickens, tricky chickens, Tobias said seriously, and playing with Bess, the wooden horse. Renna taught him a counting game her mother had taught her, using pebbles and a flat stone, and Tobias picked it up quickly, his face intent. When Phillip emerged for lunch, he found them sitting under the apple tree, Tobias explaining to Renna in great detail why chickens were both tricky and silly. Phillip stopped in the doorway, and Renna saw something vulnerable and raw cross his face before he smiled. "Looks like you've got everything under control," he said. "He's a good boy," Renna replied. Tobias beamed at the praise. The arrangement settled into routine. Renna came 3 mornings a week, sometimes 4 if Phillip had a big order. She watched Tobias, mended clothes, weeded the garden, fixed the things that Phillip didn't have time to fix. In the afternoons, when Tobias napped, Phillip taught her coopering. She learned to shape staves to fit hoops, to seal joints with tar and precision. Her hands, strong from working with horses, adapted quickly. "You're a natural," Phillip said one afternoon, watching her fit a barrel bottom. "Most people take months to get the feel of it." "I like working with my hands," Renna said. She looked up at him, caught the warmth in his eyes, and felt her cheeks flush darker. "And you're a good teacher." "I have good motivation." The air between them felt charged, the way it did before a storm. Renna set down the barrel and stood, brushing sawdust from her trousers. Phillip stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. She wanted him to. She'd been wanting it for weeks now, the memory of that first kiss haunting her at night. But then Tobias's voice called from inside the house, "Papa, I'm awake." And the moment passed. Phillip stepped back, his expression rueful, and went to get his son. Renna let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. It couldn't last. She'd known that from the beginning. The valley was too small, people too interested in other people's business. It was only a matter of time before someone decided that an orc spending time with a widower and his child was something to gossip about. And gossip in a small town could be vicious. The trouble started at the Copper Bell, of course. Renna had gone with Garrett for a quiet drink, and Phillip had been there with a few of the other farmers, discussing crop prices. When Tobias saw Renna, he'd scrambled off his father's lap and run to her, throwing his arms around her legs. It was innocent, a child happy to see a friend, but Renna saw the way the room went quiet, the way eyes tracked the interaction. One of the farmers, an older man named Silas, leaned over to Phillip and said something in a low voice. Phillip's face went still, then hard, and he said something back that made Silas's eyebrows shoot up. Renna didn't hear the words, but she felt the tension like a physical weight. She left early, Tobias's protests following her out the door. Garrett caught up with her outside. "What was that about?" Renna asked. Garrett sighed. "Silas was warning Phillip off, said people were talking, said it wasn't right, an orc woman hanging around a child." Renna's hands curled into fists. "And what did Phillip say?" "Told Silas to mind his own business and keep his prejudice to himself." Garrett put a hand on her shoulder. "Caused a bit of a stir, but most folks seem to agree with Phillip. Still, it'll make things harder." "Maybe I should stop going to his farm," Renna said quietly. "I don't want to make trouble for him, or for Tobias." "That's up to you," Garrett said. "But if you ask me, Phillip's a grown man. He can make his own choices, and he's chosen you." The words stayed with her. She spent a sleepless night in the loft, staring at the rafters, trying to decide what to do. In the morning, before she could second-guess herself, she walked to Phillip's farm. He was outside, chopping wood, his shirt damp with sweat. When he saw her, he set down the axe and waited. Tobias was playing nearby, digging in the dirt with a stick. "I heard about last night," Renna said without preamble. "Garrett told me." Phillip wiped his forehead. "I figured he would." "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did." His voice was flat, but there was steel underneath. "Silas was out of line, and he's wrong. You're the best thing that's happened to Tobias to us in a long time." Renna's breath caught. People are going to talk, Phillip. They already are. And if they decide you're not fit to raise Tobias because you're letting an orc near him, then they can try to take him from me, Phillip said, his voice low and dangerous. And they'll find out exactly how stubborn a widower can be. Phillip, I mean it, Renna. I'm not going to let small-minded bigots dictate how I live my life or who I care about. He stepped closer, his blue eyes fierce. I care about you. I think I'm falling in love with you, and if that makes me a fool, then so be it. Renna's heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She stared at him, at this kind, stubborn man who'd somehow decided she was worth fighting for. You're not a fool, she whispered. But I'm scared, Phillip. I'm scared of what people will do. I'm scared of hurting you or Tobias. I'm scared of, her voice broke. I'm scared of how much I care. Phillip reached out slowly and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and steady. Then be scared with me. We don't have to have all the answers. We just have to decide if this, he squeezed her hand, if this is worth it. Renna looked at Tobias, happily digging in the dirt, oblivious to the adult conversation. She looked at Phillip, at the hope and fear warring in his face. She thought about the weeks she'd spent here, the way Tobias's laughter had become the best part of her day, the way Phillip's presence made her feel safe and seen. She thought about the life she'd imagined for herself, solitary, focused, free of complications, and realized that it sounded lonely. It's worth it, she said. Phillip smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle and reverent, and Renna felt something inside her chest crack open. The valley did talk, as Garrett had predicted. Some of it was cruel, whispered behind hands or muttered in corners. Some of it was curious, people trying to make sense of this strange pairing. But some of it, more than Renna had expected, was supportive. Magda, surprisingly, became an ally, shouting down anyone who spoke against Renna in the tavern. The blacksmith's wife, who'd lost her own husband years ago, told Phillip approvingly that he deserved happiness. Even Silas, after a tense week, grudgingly admitted that Tobias seemed happier, and that was what mattered. Renna moved between Garrett's farm and Phillip's, her life split between horses and coopering, between her own dreams and the family she was slowly becoming part of. She and Phillip didn't rush. They were cautious, mindful of Tobias, aware that they were building something fragile and precious. They held hands when Tobias wasn't looking. They stole kisses in the cooperage, quick and sweet. They talked late into the night about everything and nothing, her childhood on the steps, his memories of Anna, their fears and hopes for the future. You ever feel guilty? Renna asked one night. They were sitting on the porch, Tobias asleep inside. About moving on. Phillip was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said finally. Not as much as I did at first, but yes. Sometimes I'll be happy and I'll think Anna should be here to see this. But then I remember something she said once, after her father died. She said that grief is love with nowhere to go. And that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to keep living, to keep loving. So that's what I'm trying to do. Renna leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. She sounds like she was a good person. She was. I think she would have liked you. You're both stubborn as hell. Renna smiled. Is that a compliment? Absolutely. Summer deepened. The days were long and hot, and Garrett's foals grew strong and sleek. Clover's filly, whom Tobias had named Star despite Garrett's protests, was thriving. Renna spent hours working with her, teaching her to lead, to trust, to accept the touch of hands and the weight of a halter. Star was bold and curious, nothing like her fearful mother, and Renna took fierce pride in that. Phillip's cooperage was busy. The harvest was coming, and farmers needed barrels for apples, for grain, for cider. He worked long hours, and Renna took on more with Tobias, bringing the boy to Garrett's farm, letting him play in the paddock while she worked with the horses. Tobias was fascinated by Star, and Renna let him brush the filly's coat, teaching him to be gentle to read the horse's body language. "You're good with him," Garrett said one afternoon, watching Tobias carefully comb Star's mane. "Natural." Renna shrugged, uncomfortable again with praise. "He's an easy kid. That's part of it, but you've got patience and you care." Garrett gave her a sly look. "Thinking of making it permanent, I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do, you and Phillip. Anyone with eyes can see it. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Renna didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. She and Phillip had been dancing around the question for weeks, neither of them willing to push, both of them afraid of moving too fast. But Garrett's words stayed with her, needling at her thoughts. That night, lying in her loft, she let herself imagine it. A life with Phillip and Tobias. Waking up in his house, making breakfast, working side by side, teaching Tobias about horses and watching him grow, building something lasting, something real. The thought terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. She was still turning it over in her mind when Phillip found her 2 days later, his face pale and drawn. "It's Tobias," he said without preamble. "He's sick, fever and coughing. I don't know what to do." Renna was on her feet instantly. "How long?" "Since this morning. I thought it was just a cold, but he's getting worse. The healer's in the next valley and I can't leave him long enough to—" "I'll go," Renna said. "You stay with him. I'll bring the healer back." She ran. It was 10 miles to the next valley, and she pushed herself hard, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The healer, an old woman named Marta, took one look at Renna's face and grabbed her bag without question. They rode back on Marta's cart, and Renna prayed to God. She wasn't sure she believed in that they'd be in time. Tobias was worse. His small face was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and raspy. Phillip sat by the bed, holding his hand, looking like a man on the edge of breaking. Marta shooed them both out and went to work, her hands quick and sure. Renna pulled Phillip onto the porch, made him sit, brought him water he didn't drink. "He's going to be fine," she said, trying to sound certain. "Marta's the best healer in 3 valleys. She'll know what to do." "He's all I have," Phillip said, his voice hollow. "If something happens to him, it won't." Renna took his hands, gripped them tight. "He's strong, and he's got you and me. We're not going to let anything happen to him." They sat there as the sun set and the stars came out. Marta worked through the night, brewing teas, applying poultices, monitoring Tobias's breathing. Just before dawn, she emerged, tired but smiling. "He'll be all right," she said. "It's lung fever, but we caught it early. Keep him warm, give him the tea I made, and he should be up and running around in a week." Phillip sagged with relief, and Renna had to catch him. Marta looked at them both, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and nodded as if confirming something. "You've got help," she said to Phillip. "That's good. A child needs more than one person. He's lucky." After Marta left, promising to return in 2 days to check on Tobias, Renna and Phillip sat by the boy's bed, watching him sleep. His breathing was easier now, the fever starting to break. Phillip held Renna's hand like a lifeline. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I couldn't have if you hadn't gone for Marta. You don't have to thank me." Renna's voice was fierce. "I love him, Phillip. I love both of you. I'm not going anywhere." Phillip turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I love you too. I should have said it before. I was scared and I was trying to be careful, but life's too short for that. I love you, Renna. I want you in my life, in Tobias's life, if you'll have us." Renna felt tears prick her eyes, and she didn't bother to hide them. "Of course I'll have you, both of you. For as long as you'll let me stay." Phillip kissed her then, slow and deep, and it felt like a promise. Tobias recovered quickly, as children do. Within a week, he was back to his usual energy, chasing chickens and begging Renna to take him to see Star. The scare had shaken both Phillip and Renna, though, and it had clarified things. They stopped dancing around the question of the future and started talking about it in concrete terms. "Move in with us," Phillip said one evening. They were in the cooperage, Renna sanding a barrel hoop. "You're here half the time anyway, and it would be easier for all of us." Renna paused. "What will people say?" "I don't care what people say." "Do you?" She thought about it. A month ago she would have said yes. She would have cared desperately, would have been paralyzed by the fear of judgment. But something had shifted. She'd faced down bigotry in the tavern. She'd watched Phillip defend her, watched the valley slowly come to accept their relationship. She'd run 10 miles to save Tobias and realized that she'd do it again in a heartbeat, that this small family mattered more than any gossip ever could. "No," she said, "I don't." "Then move in with us." She did. She said goodbye to Garrett, who hugged her with surprising strength and told her she'd always have a place at his farm if she needed it. She packed her few belongings and carried them to Phillip's house, and just like that, her life changed. She woke up to Tobias climbing into her bed, demanding stories. She cooked breakfast while Phillip worked, the smell of bread and porridge filling the house. She worked with the horses in the morning, taught coopering apprentices in the afternoon, played with Tobias in the evening. It was chaotic and exhausting and more wonderful than anything she'd ever imagined. The valley adjusted. There were still whispers, still the occasional hostile look, but Renna and Phillip faced them together, and that made all the difference. Magda started calling them the family with a knowing grin. The blacksmith's wife gave Renna her old recipe for honey cakes, the kind Tobias loved. Even Silas nodded to her in passing, a grudging acknowledgment of her place in the community. Autumn came, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The harvest was good, and Phillip's cooperage was busier than ever. Renna helped where she could, her hands growing skilled at the craft. Tobias started learning his letters, and Renna taught him to count in Orcish as well as the common tongue. They were building a life, piece by piece, and it felt solid and real and right. One evening in late autumn, as the first frost touched the ground, Phillip asked Renna to walk with him. Tobias was asleep, Garrett's wife watching him for the evening. They walked to the edge of the woods, where the old oak trees stood like sentinels, and Phillip stopped, turning to face her. "I want to marry you," he said. No preamble, no elaborate speech, just the truth, plain and simple. "I want you to be my wife. Tobias's mother if you'll have it. I know it won't be easy, I know people will talk, but I don't care, I want a life with you, Renna. A real life, not just borrowed moments. What do you say?" Renna looked at him, at this man who'd taken a joke kiss and turned it into something beautiful. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 seasons ago, so certain she was better off alone. She thought about Tobias's laughter, Phillip's steady hands, the way they'd built something together out of kindness and courage and love. "Yes," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Yes, I'll marry you." Phillip kissed her under the oak trees, and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. They married in the spring, when the valley was green and new. It was a small ceremony, just Garrett and a few close friends, Tobias standing between them with the rings tied to a ribbon. The village priest, an old man who'd seen more of the world than most, performed the ceremony without hesitation, his blessing given freely. When Phillip kissed Renna as his wife, Tobias cheered and the small gathering laughed. They held a celebration at the farm. Magda brought ale and roasted a pig. The blacksmith's wife made honey cakes. Garrett toasted them with cider and told an embarrassing story about the bet that had started it all, and Renna blushed green and laughed despite herself. Phillip held her close, his arm around her waist, Tobias dancing circles around them. "No regrets," Phillip murmured in her ear. "Not a single one." As the celebration wound down and the guests left, Renna found herself standing in the doorway of her home, their home, watching Tobias play with Star in the paddock. The filly had grown strong and beautiful, just like Clover's courage had grown. Phillip came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, and she leaned back into his warmth. "Happy?" he asked, impossibly. They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Tobias called for them to come see how high Star could jump, and Renna laughed and went to him, Phillip at her side. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and bright, and Renna knew that whatever came, they'd face it together. Spring turned to summer and the cycle continued. Garrett's mares foaled again, and Renna was there for each birth, her skill and patience making even the difficult deliveries easier. Clover had another filly, and this one Phillip insisted they name Hope, despite Renna's protest that it was too sentimental. But when she saw Tobias's face light up at the name, she relented. Phillip expanded the cooperage, adding a small room where Renna could work with leather, making harnesses and tack. They traded with the neighboring valleys, their reputation growing. Tobias thrived, bright and curious, learning his father's trade and Renna's love of horses in equal measure. He called Renna Mama Renna without prompting, and the first time he did, Renna had to excuse herself to the barn to cry. Renna's relationship with the valley deepened. She helped with foalings, with horse training, with any animal that needed a gentle hand. When the blacksmith's cow had trouble calving, he came to Renna, not the healer. When Silas's daughter wanted to learn to ride, he brought her to Renna, stiff and formal but asking nonetheless. Slowly, painfully, the valley learned that orc blood didn't make someone less, and Renna learned that not all humans were enemies. 2 years after the wedding, on a spring morning when the world smelled of apple blossoms and fresh grass, Renna woke to the sound of Tobias laughing in the yard. She rose, stretching, and found Phillip already awake, watching her with a soft smile. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking about the bet," Renna groaned. "Don't remind me." "I'm glad you lost," Phillip said. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her pointed ear. "Best thing that ever happened to me. You're sentimental in the mornings. Only with you." They heard a shout from outside, Tobias calling for them to hurry. The foals were playing and they were missing it, and Renna laughed. She rose, pulling on her clothes, and Phillip did the same. They walked out into the bright morning together, hand in hand, and Tobias ran to meet them, muddy and grinning. "Look," he said, pointing. Star and Hope were racing around the paddock, their coats gleaming, their manes flying. Clover watched from the fence, calm and proud. In the cooperage, the barrels waited, half-finished. In the garden, early vegetables were starting to push through the soil. And in the house, breakfast was waiting, the table set for 3. It wasn't a grand life. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs, built on a foundation of a lost bet, a reluctant kiss, and the slow, steady growth of love. And as Renna stood there, Phillip's hand in hers and Tobias's laughter ringing in her ears, she knew she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. That summer, Renna discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, the signs subtle but unmistakable. When Marta confirmed it, Renna sat in stunned silence, her hand pressed to her stomach. The healer smiled. "You look terrified," Marta said. "I am," Renna admitted. "I don't know how to be a mother, not really." "You've been mothering Tobias for 2 years. You'll figure it out." Marta patted her shoulder. "Besides, Phillip will be there, and that boy loves you. You've got more help than most." Telling Phillip was easier than she'd expected. He stared at her for a long moment, processing, and then his face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen. He picked her up, spinning her around, and then set her down carefully as if she might break. "We're having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are." Tobias, when they told him, was equally thrilled. He immediately started planning what he'd teach his sibling, a list that included chicken catching, barrel making, and how to tell Star from Hope. Renna laughed until her sides hurt, and Phillip just shook his head, fond and amused. The pregnancy was easy at first, but as autumn came, Renna found herself tiring more quickly. Phillip took on more of the household work, insisting she rest. Tobias became her devoted helper, bringing her water, reading to her in his halting voice, curling up beside her for naps. Garrett visited often, bringing advice and horror stories from his own 8 children, and Renna oscillated between gratitude and terror. Winter came, and with it the baby. Renna labored through the night, Phillip and Marta at her side, Tobias sleeping in the next room. It was hard and painful and endless, but when the baby finally came a boy, small and squalling, with Philip's blue eyes and Renna's green skin, Renna felt a fierce, overwhelming love that eclipsed everything else. "He's perfect," Phillip said, his voice choked. He held the baby carefully like he was made of glass and then passed him to Renna. She cradled her son, marveling at his tiny fingers, his small tusks barely visible. Tobias woke and came padding in, his eyes huge. "Baby," he whispered. "Baby," Renna confirmed. "Your brother." "Do you want to hold him?" Tobias nodded solemnly. Phillip helped him sit on the bed, and Renna placed the baby in his arms, keeping her hands close just in case. Tobias looked down at his brother with an expression of pure awe. "Hi," he said softly. "I'm Tobias. I'm your big brother. I'll teach you everything." Renna and Phillip exchanged a look over their sons' heads, and Renna saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. They named the baby Peter after Philip's father, and he fit into their lives as if he'd always been there. Tobias took his role as big brother seriously, helping with everything from diaper changes to singing lullabies. Phillip balanced work and fatherhood with practiced ease, and Renna marveled at how their family had grown. The valley welcomed Peter with surprising warmth. Gifts appeared on their doorstep: blankets, toys, jars of honey, and preserves. Magda knit a tiny hat, green to match Renna's skin. Even Silas stopped by with a carved rattle, gruff and awkward but genuine. The sight of a half-orc baby, loved and wanted, seemed to soften something in the community. Or perhaps it was simply that Renna and Phillip had proven themselves, had become a fixture of the valley rather than an oddity. The years rolled on, marked by the turning of the seasons and the growth of their family. Tobias grew tall and strong, his skill with horses and wood making him invaluable. Peter grew into a curious, adventurous boy, always climbing, always exploring. The cooperage thrived, and Renna's reputation as a horse trainer spread to the neighboring valleys. They added a room to the house, then another, the building growing with their life. When Tobias was 12 and Peter was 5, Renna sat with Phillip on the porch, watching their sons play in the yard. The evening was golden, the air soft with the promise of summer. Phillip took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You ever think about the bet?" he asked. Renna smiled. "Sometimes. Why, I was just thinking I should thank Magda. You want to thank the woman who humiliated me. She didn't humiliate you, she gave you a push, gave us both one." Phillip squeezed her hand. "If not for that bet, I might never have talked to you, might never have known what I was missing." Renna leaned her head on his shoulder, watching Tobias show Peter how to carve a piece of wood. "I suppose you're right, though I'm never admitting that to her." Phillip laughed. "Fair enough." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of their sons' laughter filling the air. The future stretched out before them, uncertain as it always was, but no longer frightening. They'd built something strong and true, something that would outlast gossip and prejudice and any obstacle the world might throw at them. A family born from a bet, a kiss, and the courage to choose love. And that, Renna thought, was worth more than all the gold in the world. As the years continued to unfold, Renna and Phillip's life became the kind of steady, joyful existence they'd both once thought impossible. Tobias, when he turned 16, asked if he could take over the cooperage, and Phillip agreed with pride and relief. The work was hard on his back now, and he was glad to pass it to capable hands. Renna continued training horses, her name known throughout the region. Peter, at 9, showed an aptitude for both trades, moving easily between the cooperage and the stables. The valley had changed too. There were more mixed families now, more willingness to look past old prejudices. An orc family moved to the next valley over, and when they came to trade, Renna greeted them in her mother's tongue, and they wept with gratitude. She and Phillip helped them settle, lent tools and advice, and watched as the community slowly expanded its definition of belonging. One spring evening, when the light was long and golden, Renna stood in the paddock with a new foal, a colt with Star's bold temperament and Clover's dark coat. Peter was beside her, learning the patience that working with young horses required. Tobias was in the cooperage with Phillip, their voices drifting across the yard as they discussed a new design. The house smelled of dinner cooking, and the chickens still tricky after all these years pecked in the dirt. Renna closed her eyes and breathed it all in. The smell of horses and sawdust, the sound of her family working and laughing, the feeling of sun on her skin. She thought about the girl she'd been, so determined to prove herself, so afraid of softness. She thought about Phillip, grieving and exhausted, convinced he'd never feel joy again. And she thought about Tobias, scared and lonely, needing more than one person could give. They'd all been lost in their own ways, and then a bet, a kiss, and a choice to keep showing up had changed everything. "Mama," Peter called. "The colt's coming over." Renna opened her eyes. The colt was indeed approaching, curious and cautious. She held out her hand, letting him sniff, and he bumped his soft nose against her palm. Peter laughed in delight. "He likes you," he said. "Most horses do," Renna replied, "if you're patient and kind." "Like you and Papa," Peter said, with the simple wisdom of children. Renna's throat tightened. "Yes," she said, "like that." Phillip appeared then, Tobias beside him, their work done for the day. Phillip's hair was gray at the temples now, and there were more lines around his eyes, but his smile was the same. He came to stand beside Renna, his arms slipping around her waist, and they watched their son's work with the colt, guiding him, teaching him. "Not bad," Phillip murmured, "for a life that started with a lost bet." Renna turned to kiss him, quick and sweet. "Best bet I ever lost." They stood together as the sun set, as the stars began to appear, as their family moved around them in the easy rhythm of love and labor. And in that moment, Renna knew with absolute certainty that she was home, not because of a place or a house, but because of the people in it. The man who'd bent down to let a mortified orc girl keep her honor. The boy who'd called her nice green lady before he knew her name. The son they'd made together, half human and half orc, proof that love could bridge any divide. It had been a long road from that tavern doorway to this moment. But every step, every choice, every hard-won piece of trust had been worth it. And as Renna stood there, surrounded by her family, she knew that this was the life she'd been meant to live all along. She just hadn't known it until a bet, a kiss, and a single father with a toddler on his hip had walked through a door and changed everything. The end came not with drama but with contentment. Peter grew and learned, eventually taking over the horse training from Renna when her joints began to ache with age. Tobias married a girl from the next valley, and gave them grandchildren who climbed on Renna's lap and begged for stories about the old days. Phillip and Renna grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, weathered by time but unbroken. When the village held its spring festival, years and years after that first bet, Renna and Phillip stood at the edge of the gathering, watching their grandchildren dance. Magda, ancient now and walking with a cane, shuffled over to them. "Never thought I'd see the day," she said, her voice cracked with age. "An orc and a human married 40 years. 38, Renna corrected. "Close enough," Magda cackled. "Best bet I ever rigged." "You what?" Renna stared at her. Magda's eyes gleamed with mischief. "You think I didn't know Phillip was coming? I saw him through the window, saw the boy on his hip, and thought, now there's a man who needs someone, and there you were, all fire and pride. Figured you'd be good for each other." Phillip laughed, the sound rich and warm. "You old schemer. Someone had to do it. You were both too stubborn to see sense on your own." Magda patted Renna's arm. "Worked out, didn't it?" "It did," Renna admitted. She looked at Phillip, at the life they'd built, at the family that surrounded them. "It really did." Magda nodded, satisfied, and shuffled off to meddle in someone else's life. Renna and Phillip stood hand in hand, watching the festival, watching their legacy dance and laugh and live. And when Phillip turned to kiss her, soft and familiar, Renna kissed him back and thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The fear and the courage, the pain and the joy, the thousand small choices that had woven their lives together. "I love you," Phillip said. "I love you too," Renna replied. "Always have, always will." And under the spring stars, in the valley that had become their home, they stood together. Two people who'd found each other by chance and held on by choice, who'd taken a moment of embarrassment and turned it into a lifetime of love. Who'd proven that family wasn't about blood or species, but about the bonds you chose to forge and the courage to keep choosing them, day after day, year after year. It was a good life. A simple life, full of work and laughter, challenges and triumphs, ordinary moments that added up to something extraordinary. And when people asked Renna if she regretted that bet, that kiss, that single moment that had changed her entire world, she would smile, her tusks showing, her green skin weathered by sun and time, and say simply, "Not for a single second," because it was true, every word of it. And that truth, solid and real and unshakable, was the greatest gift of all.